Alright, so to get the type of finish we want, what we're going to be doing is, instead of just applying shoe polish directly to the PVC pipe, we're going to paint it first. Now you're going to need your shoe polish. This is just a brown shoe polish. This is going to give us sort of a brown color. It's really good for doing wood grain effects. Now for your base color, I'm going to be using yellow today. You want something that's light or a bright color, because when you put the dye over it, it's going to darken it. If you're starting with a dark color, you probably won't see the effect because it'll just get really, really dark, unless that's what you're going for. Now, since we're trying to sort of mimic cypress wood or a similar wood, this yellow is going to give a sort of an orangey brown color once we put the dye over it. Now, I normally like to use flat or matte or satin paints, but it just so happens that I could only find a gloss version of this yellow. I like looking for like the Krylon Fusions or the Rust-Oleum plastics, something that'll bond well to a plastic. Because we're going to be dyeing over this, you don't need to use a primer, though you can if you'd like to. And then the only thing you really need to do is sand the bow first. I'm going to be using a sanding sponge. I'm going to be using it wet. This is going to keep dust from coming up, and we're also going to be using it in between coats for painting. And then finally, you're going to need some paper towels. This is for creating our wood grain finish. And then I've got some clear coat. This is just a Krylon flat clear, because I like that flat look. If you want gloss, you can go with gloss. If you like sort of in between, you could do a semi-gloss. So that's pretty much it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sand this with my sanding block. I'm going to put my base coat on it, and I'll show you what it looks like after the base coat is applied. So here we go. Alright, here's the bow with the base coat. So you can see it's got yellow. It's kind of glossy. So what I'm going to be doing now is taking the sanding sponge. This is the medium grit. I'm going to be lightly sanding this. Now we're sanding this regardless of whether you use glossy or matte or flat colors. You want to sand in between coats. This is going to rough up the surface and allow the dye to really sink in. Another thing it's going to do is it's going to cut some of this finish, because when you paint, even if it's not glossy, there's still the surface basically becomes impervious to a lot of other things, especially if you're using different paints or different types of finishes on top of each other. I'm taking this sponge and I've soaked this in water. Just want to go ahead and lightly sand the bow. Now you want to go light because you don't actually want to go through the paint down to the PVC. You're just doing this light. Another thing this is going to do is sort of cut the surface, and when we do our stain, you're going to have what looks like an underlying wood grain. It's basically when we do our finish, it's essentially adding some texture, and we're also going to be making it look like this bow has growth rings to it. This right here will add something that kind of looks like that underlying grain that wood has. So once it's really lightly done, I'm going to go ahead and just wipe this down with a dry paper towel or a dry lint-free cloth. Just wipe it down, let it dry. Once it's completely dry, then we'll start dyeing it. So I'm going to let this dry, and I'll show you what that looks like. Alright, so now that this is dry, I'm going to take my shoe polish, and I'm just going to apply shoe polish over the bow. Now at this point, we're not doing anything special, we're just putting shoe polish on the bow. So you just want to get the polish on the bow, make sure you've hit all recessed spots and everything, and you've got this whole thing covered. We're going to work half of the bow at a time, so from the center of the handle to the tip. That way we can let one side dry we can seal one side, and then we can work on the other side, and that'll minimize the chances of ruining the finish. So you take your shoe polish, and you just want to go ahead, get it started, and then just apply it. Now it's going to go on a little unevenly. That's going to start establishing your pattern. And as it dries a little bit while you're applying it, that's sort of going to create a base on which we're going to build. As you can see. At this point, it doesn't matter really what it looks like. It's all about getting this bow covered. You just keep applying dye until you reach the center of the bow. So it's right in the center of the handle. What's kind of neat is that bows like this, it almost looks like you spliced two pieces of wood together in the handle. You just want to go make sure you get everything. Alright, so now that you've got this, we're going to lighten this up by taking our paper towel, starting at the bottom, long strokes just to establish our base. So just really gentle strokes all the way to the end. So we're creating really straight grained effect. Now cypress is kind of a neat wood. It's got very tight, sometimes really active grain. So you could go ahead and you could create, you know, little swirls in the grain like this, or you could just keep it straight. I like, especially when I was making wooden bows, I liked it when a bow had nice straight grain on the backside, because boring grain equals a long-lasting bow. Usually, there are exceptions. So I like making this as boring as possible. Then on the belly side, you want to create sort of the effect that you've got some grain going on, or some growth rings. So you just sort of alternate going from left to right to sort of feather this. The effect is really subtle. But I think I pretty much got it. Okay. So as you can see, it's pretty much just straight grain on the back. Then on the belly side, you can see there's a little bit of growth rings, like the growth rings are coming in, and then, you know, the wood, the taper is taking over, and you're cutting through a growth ring here, cutting through a growth ring here, cutting through a growth ring here, and so on, all the way to the end. So this is pretty much where I want it. This is the color I was going for. Sort of a yellow, orangey sort of color. Now what I'm going to do is you can either let this dry completely, or you can do what I'm going to do, and I'm going to cheat, use the heat gun to speed this up. You want to go really light with the heat gun on the lowest setting, just until this is no longer wet to the touch. Then we're going to go again with the sandpaper really light. This is really, really light with the sandpaper, even lighter than when we did the paint, because too much pressure and you'll take this right off. You just want to really lightly hit it with the sandpaper. And then I'm going to clear coat at least half of this limb so I can handle it. We'll do the other side and we'll finish this up. So here you can see, this is the side with the shoe polish. This is the side without the shoe polish. And you can see that sort of wood grain effect we've got going with the growth rings. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and let this dry, do a light sand, and then I'm going to clear coat it. So here we go. Okay, so here's the finish so far. You can see I've got that really subtle look here on the back, and then you kind of see that sort of effect of the growth rings on the belly side. Well, now what I'm going to do is I've clear coated this side so you can actually see the area near the handle is a little more glossy, and then this side is clear coated. So I put 2 coats of clear coat. That's going to protect this finish and keep it from coming off. It's also going to offer a little bit of UV resistance as well. Now what I'm going to be doing is the same thing to the other side. Really simple. Take the dye and you just do the same thing we did on the other side to this side. So you just want to spread the dye on there. Okay. Okay, you want to bring it down to the center. They're going to kind of overlap a little bit. Once you've completely covered the limb, you're going to take your paper towel and same thing, go from the base to the end. Light strokes. There we go. And so again, I'm going to go down by the handle, or not by the handle, but starting from the handle, I'm going to kind of give that angled effect to give it the look of growth rings getting cut through. Okay. I'm going to apply just a little bit more here. All right, so there it is. So we have the back side, and we have the belly side. So now you want to go ahead and let this dry. Once that's dry, you want to clear coat this whole bow. Now one of the things is that when you overlap, you will get this sort of darker color. So if you're going to leave it like this, you might want to think ahead of time and really work this nicely so that it looks like you have a V-splice or some sort of splice here. I'm going to be covering this up, so it's not going to be a big deal for this particular bow. but it's something to think about. So I'm going to go ahead, let this dry, then I'm going to finish it off, and then I'll show you what that looks like. Here it is. So as you can see, we've got the belly side, which has a little bit of that sort of growth ring effect to it. You can see. And then you have the back, which is pretty much straight. This side I ended up getting some strange things going on, but I think it adds character. So for right now, I'm just going to let this dry completely. You don't want to string this up, you don't want to shoot it right now, because you know the finish is still curing. You're going to want to let this sit ideally for 3 days. If you can't let it sit for 3 days and you want to shoot it sooner, then just let it sit overnight. Let the clear coat, you know, really dry and get solid. So what we're going to be doing next, or what I'm going to be doing next, is I'm going to be covering up this gap here on the back and belly side of the bow, and I'm also going to be wrapping the handle. So I'm going to let this dry, and then we're going to come back to it, and I'm going to show you how to wrap the handle and how to cover these up. There we go.